brother Warney said there were a lot of you, but I didn't expect quite this many. Well, you're welcome to our house. I hope you're not too squashed in. I trust you've been enjoying Oxford. It's a wonderful city. I don't get in as much as I would like, because these pins aren't quite what they used to be, but when I do, I very much enjoy it. By the way, if you have a chance to walk through Headington, our little village, I think you'll enjoy it. It's like most villages, it has its charms. So, you're all writers, are you? And scholars. Oh dear, one feels a little unnerved. It's almost like being a lion in a den of Daniels. And you're all from America. I must say, without my American readers, my success as an author would be somewhat diminished. What do they say? A prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. I think that applies to authors as well, especially in this city. Now, I tell you what, it reminds me of a little ditty I once read. I hope I can remember it. Wee Lewis is burnt out quickly, I'm afraid. I think it goes something like this. An author from Merrow was a very odd fellow. He only could write in a tub. With waterproof ink and steaming hot drink, he would write till he needed some grub. When he bathed in red wine, he wrote words of rhyme and sent them to ladies of fame. But these ladies of note forgot what he wrote and couldn't remember his name. When he bathed in hot tea, he wrote mystery and sent them to New Scotland Yard. But these words of intrigue were hard to believe, and they sued him for dubious yarns. When he bathed in cow's milk, his words were like silk, and he sent them to men of the cloth. But these gossamer notes were fed to the goats, and they all developed a cough. When he bathed in neat gin, he wrote with a grin, and sent them to jesters and clowns. But these voluble puns were easy to shun, for not one could vanquish a frown. When he bathed in pea soup, his words were astute, and he sent them to those of sharp wit. But these words for the wise were quickly despised, being seen as the work of a twit. One day in his tub he started to blub, for all of his writings were spurned. His friends even said, "Your writings we dread. 'Twould be best if they all should be burned." So this author in vain then boarded a plane and flew to a land far away. But in this new land, his writings seemed grand. 3 cheers for the US of A. You won't mind if I use this chair, do you? It's a little farther back. I'm going to bring it up. Warney's always moving the chairs, you know. That's better. Of course, I want to be able to see you. My health is not what it was, but I do feel a little invigorated today, so I'm very glad of your company. A little while ago, I had a heart attack, and I was very convinced at the time that I was about to enter in, as they say. But as you can see, my entrance was postponed. I can't help feeling that it was rather a pity I did survive. I mean, having glided so painlessly up to the gate, to have it shut in one's face seems a little hard. Especially knowing that someday the whole process must be gone through again, and perhaps a little less pleasantly. Though they call Stephen the first martyr, I sometimes think that Lazarus had the raw ordeal. Now, you won't mind if I indulge in a cup of tea, will you? I find that tea keeps me going. I feel a little bad because I'd hoped Warney would be here to make you a cup of tea before we got started. Unfortunately, he had to pop out quite suddenly. I say suddenly. His departure seemed to coincide with the arrival of your bus. But hopefully, if he gets back, we'll rustle you up a cup of tea, and we'll send you on your way rejoicing, won't we? You Americans drink iced tea, don't you? How strange. Still, I suppose that dates back to your first big tea party. You dumped it in cold water then, and you've been doing it ever since. By the way, Professor Tolkien tells me that he very much enjoyed his luncheon with you. Said it was one of the highlights of his calendar year. Well done. The professor is not an easy man to impress. I should know. Don't get me wrong. We have been friends for many, many years now. Indeed, he and I, along with a few other writers, used to meet quite regularly. Men splendid among men, as Charles used to say. We called our little band the Inklings, and our chief occupation was to read to one another manuscripts that were works in progress. If I'm not mistaken, Tollers, that's what the professor is called in the inner sanctum, Tollers read the whole of The Lord of the Rings to us long before it was ever published. What a book. In its mounting levels of grandeur and terror, I judged it almost unequal in the whole range of narrative art. A man's fertility of imagination never ceases to amaze me. I remember one day I was working on a manuscript that I was particularly keen to read to Tollers. I was feeling unusually positive about it. I think that should have been the first warning sign. After I'd read the first few chapters, there was a stony silence, and Tollers was sat there rubbing his chin. "Jack," he said, "I dislike it intensely. It really won't do, you know. Why don't you put your efforts into something more worthwhile?" Professor's not a man to mince words. Well, after such stinging censure, I shelved the project to get on to something more worthwhile. Sometimes later, I was going through some old papers. You're all writers, aren't you? Do you tend to find that you accumulate papers? I do. And then the pile builds up to the point where I can't find anything I really want to find. Well, I've managed to solve this problem. You see, we never have enough paper to light our fires with in the winter. So every now and then I go through this pile and pull out obsolete papers, and I pull out half-finished manuscripts that I'm not going to complete, or Tollers doesn't want me to complete, and then I throw them in the fire paper basket. Indeed, when I have a book published, I usually do exactly the same with the original manuscript. Charles rather scurrilously says that I should save these manuscripts for posterity, to which I reply that posterity has been blamed for far too many things already. Anyway, in this particular clear-out session, I came across the manuscript that Tollers had so roundly condemned, and I was just about to throw it away, and I thought, well, I'll give it a read. I can't do any harm. Do you know, I was enthralled, even though I'd written it myself. So I thought, I'm going to finish it, even though I will probably incur the wrath of my illustrious colleague, and that's exactly what I did. I sent it to my publisher, and he was so enthusiastic he rushed it to the presses. And I'm very glad to say that 13 years later, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is still in print. Now, it is my usual custom, when I have a book published, to send a first edition copy to Tollers. But I decided not to do it this time. I didn't want him to think that I was making a point, so you won't find it on his bookshelves, I don't think, nor, for that matter, will you find it on the bookshelves of many of my illustrious Oxford colleagues. I think they regard my children's books as a betrayal of my position as an Oxford Don. I'm quite sure they regard my Christian books as a betrayal of my position as an Oxford intellectual. Not that I consider myself an intellectual. My wife was a little more blunt. Jack, she once said, the way you and your Oxford cronies sometimes pontificate, anyone would think that if you were all drowned at sea, the world would grind to a halt. Personally, my sympathies would be with the fish. I think when I accepted a professorship at Cambridge, there was a quiet jubilation amongst many of Oxford's elite. They thought I would be packing my bags and leaving town. But as I could easily commute to Cambridge, I had absolutely no intention of leaving the city I'd lived in or near for the last 30 years. So we didn't move. And here we are, still at the kilns. I often wonder what will happen to it when Warnie and I are gone. Judging by the number of tourists in this town, probably it will be bought by some Americans, I should think. Well, it'll serve them right. When they move the bookcases, the walls will fall down. By the way, I say we didn't move and we lived here. I'm, of course, referring to my brother and I. My wife died 3 years ago. It's funny, really. When we were very young, Warnie and I used to spend a lot of time on our own. Now that the twilight years have rolled in, we find ourselves on our own again. And still, I might say, content with our own company. I don't know whether I should let you into a little secret. Warnie would be horrified. But as he's gone AWOL, he can hardly argue the point, can he? I sometimes call him BPB. He sometimes calls me SPB. SPB stands for Small Piggy Bottom. So I think you can deduce what BPB stands for. That's what our nurse Lizzie Endicott called us when we were young. Precisely what inspired her to so name us, I'm sure I can leave to your own fertile imaginations. Suffice it to say, the tradition remains till this day. Oh, not in public, you understand. It would hardly add to our reputation as if, when I was with the bank manager, I asked him whether Big Piggy Bottom needed to sign the document as well. I'm sure some people would say it's childish. I think we see it as a celebration of a relationship. No doubt the practice will continue till the day we die. I've told Warnie that if he goes first, I know what I'm going to inscribe on his gravestone. Here lies Warnie, brother dear, who couldn't say no to a glass of beer. Here lies Warnie, soldier brave, who beat his brother to this grave. Here lies Warnie, he'll ne'er be forgotten, not with a name like Big Piggy Bottom. Warnie and I were allies from the start. And when we moved to our new house, our large house, just outside of Belfast, we were in our element. Seemed more like a city than a house. If the story of Clive Staples Lewis is ever written, and God forbid that posterity should once again be so lumbered, I think this house would feature as a major character. I'm a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, indoor upstairs silences, attics to be explored in solitude, and endless books. I always had as much certainty of finding a new book in our house as a man has of finding a fresh blade of grass in a lush green meadow. One day I was thumbing through a book of poetry by Longfellow, and I came across these words. I heard a voice that cried, "Balder the Beautiful is dead, dead." I had never even heard of Balder, yet these words brought on an extraordinary mystical feeling, a notion of great cold expanses of northern sky. I couldn't say exactly what I felt, only that it was a sense of exhilarating joy, and the more I tried to recapture the initial sensation, the more it slipped away. I think as a child I was very precocious. I once remember walking into my parents, I think I was only 4 years old at the time, and saying that I did not like Clive, much less did I like Staples, and that I would only answer to the name of Jaxie. And from that time on, I was known as Jaxie Lewis, which was later modified to Jack. When I was 6 years old, Mother took Warnie and I to France for a short holiday. Father didn't come. Father was a man married to daily routine, so holidays were anathema to him. Anyway, when we got back, I happened to bump into Father in the living room. "Oh, hello, Jack," he said. "How do you like France?" I said, "Well, I like it very much, Father, though I find I have a prejudice against the French." "Oh, really?" he said. "Why is that?" I said, "Father, if I knew that, it wouldn't be a prejudice, would it?" It's one of the first times I ever saw him speechless. Mother just burst into laughter. She had a laugh that could inspire 1,000 laughs. Mother was our rock, our fortress, almost the sole architect of our humdrum happiness. So when she died with cancer, it was the end of my world. The long corridors became long, empty corridors. The empty, sunlit rooms became rooms blackened by the heavy drapes that were drawn across the windows. The upstairs indoor silences gave way to the cheerless sounds of weeping and lifeless dialogue. And the attics to be explored in solitude became attics to cry in solitude. Our rock had sunk into the sea like Atlantis. Our fortress had crumbled. The laughter had been silenced. And I was 10 years old. Not long after Mother died, I was forced to leave my beloved house. Oh, not because Father was selling it, but because I was being sent to boarding school in England. Can you imagine the desolation of a 10-year-old boy who has been stripped of much of what he holds dear and then finds himself traveling to a foreign and foreboding land? Fortunately, Warnie was with me. I remember that it was a very rough sea crossing. Warnie was seasick. Absurdly, I rather envied this achievement and spent the rest of the journey trying to replicate it myself. And when I did manage it, it was a very poor affair. Apparently, I'm a very good sailor. Our destination was a little town 20 miles north of London, of which the principal establishment was Wynnard Boarding School, the school to which we were being sent. Now, use your imaginations. It is September 1908, and there is a young boy standing at the classroom door. He is sweating and itching thanks to the thick, dark, woolly clothes he is wearing. He is being throttled by a highly starched white collar. His feet are already aching in unaccustomed boots, and he is wearing knickerbockers buttoned up to the knee. Worst of all is a bowler hat, apparently made of iron, which grips his head. That was me. And I remember thinking then that if prison uniforms were anything like this, then I would remain a model citizen for the rest of my life. Wynnard was a small school, 20 or so boarders. Thus, the teaching staff consisted of the proprietor and the headmaster. We called him Oldie, and his browbeaten son, Wee Wee. Now, quite how he came to be named Wee Wee, one can only surmise. The in-joke amongst the boarders was that when he was being dressed for his christening, his infant baptism, someone forgot to put his nappy on. I think you call it a diaper. And then when he was being held over the font and felt water on his head, it started the waterworks at the other end, and the vicar said the first thing that came into his mind. Oldie lived in a solitude of power. like the sea captains in the days of sail. And he revelled in cruelty. I have known Oldie many times come into a room, stand there, and his eyes would go to and fro, ravenously looking for some poor soul to settle on. And then when he found somebody, he would say, "Oh, there you are, Rez, you horrid little boy. If I don't feel too tired this afternoon, I shall give you a good drubbing." Despite all this cruelty, we did surprisingly little work. I think there was only one good thing that befell me at Wynnard. It was there that I first began to seriously read my Bible and to pray. Intellectually, however, my time at Oldie's was almost entirely wasted. Had the school not closed down and had I remained there for another 2 years, I think my fate as a scholar would have been sealed for good. But it was closed down after an investigation following an incident when a boy was viciously beaten by Oldie. Do you know, not long after that, Oldie was certified insane. Well, from the tyranny of Wynnard, I went for a short while to a preparatory school and then off to Malvern College in England, another boarding school where a different form of tyranny reigned, prefects who lost no opportunity in venting their spite against the new boys. But despite all this, it was at Malvern that my education really began, and it was also at Malvern that I retreated from whatever belief I had in Christianity. And so little by little, with fluctuations I cannot now trace, I became an atheist, dropping my so-called faith with no real sense of loss, and I might say a good deal of relief. Of course, like so many atheists, I was living in a world of contradictions. I maintained that God did not exist, but I was very angry with him for not existing. I once remember another little ditty. It's a bit silly, but it does sum up my situation. I hope I can remember it. One day I'm going to get caught out. Some say there is a being, divine or otherwise, who made the sun, the moon, the earth, and all the host of stars. A being who made man and beast, the greatest to the very least. He spoke with might, and there was light. One word, and there was Mars. Some say that it's not so. There is no architect. The universe and all we see is all just there by chance. That man and beast are all the same, soulless creatures with different names. There is no why. We live and die. Life's just a fleeting dance. I find I'm in a quandary. The more I look, the less I see. I say, oh well, it's hard to tell. Thank God that I'm an atheist. You'll get it. Well, if Malvern College saw my decline into youthful atheism, my arrival at the great Knox house heralded a season in which that atheism found a willing mentor. The great Knock was a tutor to whom my father sent me in Great Bookham in Surrey, which is in the south of England. His full name was W.T. Kirkpatrick. I called him the Great Knock, and he was an Ulsterman with an intellect built on fierce logic. The only illogical behavior I ever saw him indulge in was when on Sundays he put on his best suit to dig the garden. I shall never forget the first time I met him. He had collected me from the railway station, and we were traveling to his home in his car, and I happened to say that I thought the scenery in Surrey was much wilder than I'd expected. "Stop," said the Great Knock as the car screeched to a halt. "What do you mean by wildness, and what grounds did you have for not expecting it?" Well, as answer upon answer was rejected, it soon became apparent that I had no clear idea corresponding to the word wildness, and insofar as I had any idea at all, wildness was a singularly inept word. "Do you not see, then," concluded the Great Knock, that your remark was meaningless? I was even afraid to say yes. I often wish I could have been a fly on the wall when he was talking to his wife. Oh, hello, dear. You're home early. I hadn't expected you so soon. Stop, woman. What do you mean by early? And what grounds did you have for not expecting me so soon? Well, I grew very fond of the great Knock, and I owe him a debt I can never repay. You see, my father had sent me to him to prepare me for the entrance examinations into Oxford University, and in that he was very successful. Thanks to his teaching skills, I won a scholarship to University College, Oxford. And I took up my studies there in 1916. Of course, I had to lay them down in 1970 when I was drafted into the army to play my part in the First World War. But my army career wasn't very distinguished. As soon as I arrived at the front lines in France, I was hospitalized with trench fever. Thereafter, I was only ever in serious danger twice. Once when an enemy shell exploded by one of our latrines. Unfortunately, I was in residence at the time, which meant for a hasty evacuation. Well, that's an unfortunate choice of words, isn't it? The other time was when a shell burst behind our front lines. It was an English shell, what they call friendly fire. Well, now there's a contradiction in terms. You all right, Bill? No, that blasted German shell just blew my leg off. It wasn't a German shell, Bill, it was an English one. Oh, well, that's all right then, isn't it? Well, it was a friendly shell, that English shell, for me anyway. Though I received superficial flesh wounds, so they were enough to have me sent back to England, and by the time I had recovered, the war was over. I still have a relic up here, a little bit of shrapnel that's still there. The doctors thought it was too close to the heart to mess around with, and they said it wouldn't do any harm. So if any of you have got any magnets, don't get them out, as you might find I'm rather drawn to you. Well, I took up my studies again at University College, and by that time, of course, I had a love of philosophy and English language, and all my studies were weighted in that direction. And I passed the various examinations with sufficient distinction to allow me to bide my time in Oxford to await, hopefully, a suitable appointment. And in May the 22nd, I think it was, 1925, I leapt out of bed and rushed to the front door to collect the Times newspaper in which was published the announcement I had been waiting for so long. The President and Fellows of Magdalen College, Oxford, have appointed to an official fellowship in the college as tutor of English language and literature, Mr. Clive Staples Lewis. And that's where, for the next 30 years, I tutored my students. It's during that time I wrote most of my books. Now I can see what you're thinking. Oh, here it comes. A tedious bibliography. Well, you'll be pleased to know that I am not going to indulge in that questionable practice of telling you what I wrote and why I wrote it. I will say this, though. I was very glad that my general outlook on life changed before I wrote most of my books. Otherwise, some of them I would have had to rewrite, and others I would never have written at all. You see, by my early 30s, I had not only abandoned my atheistic philosophy, I had come to see it as an utterly vacuous doctrine. Mind you, I wasn't yet ready to accept Christianity, much less the concept of a perfect being sacrificing himself for a mass of imperfect beings. I had somewhat begrudgingly come to the conclusion that some sort of God was the least objectionable theory, but I still viewed God as a rather crude, nursery-like word, and so I resorted to referring to fundamental truth as a spirit, while at the same time maintaining there was absolutely no possibility of having a personal relationship with this spirit.